What if I told you that in the heart of medieval Rome, a dead pope was dragged from his grave to stand trial? Why would the Catholic Church put a rotting corpse in papal robes, seat him on a throne, and accuse him of crimes before the eyes of horrified cardinals? Was this justice or madness? This is the story of the Cadaver Synod, one of the most shocking episodes in all of medieval history. A tale of power, vengeance, and humiliation, where politics overruled sanctity and faith gave way to spectacle. Stay with us as we uncover how Pope Formosus was condemned even in death, how his trial spiraled into chaos, and why this bizarre act would haunt the Church for centuries. Because sometimes, the darkest trials are the ones no living man could survive. Part 1. The Court of the Dead. What drives a society to drag a corpse into the halls of power? What fear, what hatred, what desperate hunger for legitimacy compels the living to put the dead on trial? Rome, in the year 897, was not the Rome of marble splendor that had once ruled the world. It was a city of shadows, caught in the death spiral of empire, gnawed at by petty rivalries, consumed by a decaying church. Papal authority, far from being the serene throne of St. Peter, had become a game of knives, poisoned cups, whispered plots, and daggers drawn beneath the cassocks of ambitious men. And into this maelstrom came an event so grotesque that even after 11 centuries, it still chills the imagination: the Cadaver Synod. Picture the scene: the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Mother Church of Rome, a place meant for holy rites and sacred liturgy, but on a January day, it was transformed into something monstrous. Candles flickered upon marble, the shadows of saints and martyrs painted upon the walls. Yet at the center sat not a living pope, but a dead one. Pope Formosus, buried months before, his body exhumed, his flesh already wasted by decay, now dressed in the full regalia of pontifical splendor. He was propped upon a throne, mitre on his skull, staff jammed into a stiffening hand, his corpse presiding over his own trial. And before him, the living assembled, bishops, priests, cardinals, and above all, Pope Stephen VI, the man who had summoned this blasphemous spectacle. His voice thundered, accusing the husk of Formosus of perjury, of ambition, of sins too grave to be borne. As if the dead might speak in his own defense, a deacon was appointed to answer for the corpse. The court became theater. The bishops muttered. The people watched in horrified silence, and the cadaver, swaying in its chair, became both defendant and symbol, a puppet for the vengeance of the living. Why? Why would men of the cloth, men sworn to God, orchestrate such a spectacle? The answer lies in politics, in vengeance, in the endless struggle for the papal throne that had become the true battleground of medieval Rome. For the papacy was no longer just a shepherd's staff, it was a crown, a scepter, the power to make and unmake kings. But in that moment, none of this mattered to the crowd who stood in the basilica. What mattered was the horror before their eyes, the smell of death in holy air, the sight of a pope turned into a grotesque effigy, the sense that Rome itself had lost its sanity. And so we begin our tale, not with the majesty of faith, but with the corruption of power, the theatre of vengeance, and the trial of a corpse. A story that forces us to ask, how far can the living go in their hunger to control the past? And when justice itself is turned into spectacle, what hope remains for truth? Part 2. The Seeds of Vengeance. To understand why a corpse was dragged into court, we must step back from the grotesque stage of 897 and enter the world that made it possible. Rome, at the close of the 9th century, was a city bleeding from within. It was not emperors and senators who held power, but noble families and warlords, each clawing for dominance, each seeking to put their pope upon the throne of St. Peter. The papacy, once spiritual shepherd, had become the prize in a vicious game of dynastic survival. And in this deadly contest stood Pope Formosus. Formosus was not a stranger to controversy. Before his papacy, he had been Bishop of Porto, a diplomat shuttling between kingdoms, a man whose skills in negotiation earned both admiration and suspicion. He had been sent on missions to Bulgaria, to the Frankish kings of the north, and each time he returned more entangled in the web of politics that smothered Christendom. Some saw him as a statesman, others as a schemer. But his greatest gamble came when the Holy Roman throne itself fell into dispute. Should Rome favor the Carolingians in France, or the powerful dukes of Spoleto in Italy? To choose wrongly was to make an enemy for life, and Formosus, pragmatic or ambitious, depending on whom you ask, chose the Carolingian claimant, Arnulf of Carinthia. He invited Arnulf into Italy, crowned him emperor, and in doing so turned his back upon the Spoletans. That single act sealed his fate. The Spoletan family, powerful, ruthless, entrenched in Roman politics, had long considered the papacy their inheritance. To see Formosus raise up a foreigner over their claims was unforgivable. They bided their time, their hatred ripening in silence. When Formosus died in 896, the city may have thought the quarrel buried with him, but vengeance is not so easily silenced. It was under the reign of his successor, Pope Stephen VI, that the storm broke. Stephen himself was a man of volatile temper, installed with Spoletan backing. To him, the papal chair was not a throne of unity but a powder keg of rivalries. His own position was precarious, his legitimacy questioned. How could he secure his place? By destroying the memory of Formosus, by turning his very bones into a weapon. And so whispers began. Formosus had been unworthy. He had betrayed Rome. His ordinations were invalid, his actions unlawful. But words alone were not enough. The Spoletans demanded spectacle, demanded humiliation, demanded that the man who had defied them be disgraced, not only in life, but in death. Thus, the stage was set for an act of vengeance without precedent, a posthumous trial. Think of it. In a city supposedly the heart of Christendom, where martyrs' relics were venerated, where the bones of saints were kissed and carried in procession, the bones of a pope were to be dragged from their grave and condemned. Holiness was to be weaponized. Death itself was to become theater. The people of Rome could scarcely believe it when rumors spread, Formosus will be tried. Tried? How does one question the dead? Yet in that Rome, where politics devoured faith, even the grave offered no sanctuary. Part 3. The Exhumation. Death had already claimed Pope Formosus. He had lain in his tomb for 9 months, beneath the cold stones of St. Peter's Basilica, wrapped in his papal vestments, granted, at least in appearance, the dignity of a Christian burial. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. But not for Formosus. In Rome of 897, the dead could be summoned back into the land of the living, not by miracles, but by politics. Pope Stephen VI, trembling on his fragile throne, gave the order. The Spoletan lords whispered approval. And so, one moonless night, men were dispatched into the crypt. Torches flickered against damp stone as they pried open the coffin. The stench of decay filled the air, a heavy, choking reminder of what 9 months in the grave does to flesh. Imagine the scene, grim-faced attendants hauling the remains of a pope from his resting place, dressing his withered corpse once more in papal robes, the triple crown placed upon a skull, the ring of St. Peter forced upon stiffened fingers. What dignity death had granted was stripped away, replaced with grotesque parody. But to Stephen and his masters, this was not sacrilege. This was theatre. The people of Rome awoke to whispers that spread like wildfire. Formosus walks again. Crowds gathered in the streets, muttering prayers, crossing themselves. Some believed it was blasphemy beyond forgiveness. Others, eager for spectacle in a city that fed on drama, leaned in with morbid fascination. The corpse was not hidden. No, it was carried, in daylight, to the Lateran Basilica, seat of the papal court. There, a tribunal had been prepared, as though for a living man. A throne draped in silk stood at the center, and upon that throne, stiff as wood, rotting beneath the robes of the papacy, sat Pope Formosus. At his side was appointed a deacon, his advocate. Imagine the horror of that role, a living man commanded to speak on behalf of the dead, to answer accusations hurled at a skull. The mockery was deliberate. It was meant to strip Formosus not only of his authority, but of his humanity. The citizens of Rome filed in, faces pale in the torchlight. Some muttered in disbelief, others laughed nervously, but none dared speak against the Pope, who now presided. On the dais, Stephen VI sat with eyes blazing, robes dishevelled, his voice trembling with rage and triumph. Before him, his enemy sat silent, incapable of reply. yet dragged into humiliation. Thus the stage was set. The Cadaver Synod was not merely a trial, it was a performance of hatred, a ritual of revenge. The air hung thick with incense and rot, candle smoke mingling with the scent of corruption. The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between horror and curiosity, knowing they were about to witness something no generation before had ever seen, a dead pope put on trial by the living. And with a pounding of the gavel, the accusations began. Part 4. The accusations of the dead. The tribunal began not with dignity, but with fury. On the raised platform of the Lateran Basilica, Pope Stephen VI leaned forward, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. Before him sat the corpse of Formosus, rigid and grotesque in papal vestments, a parody of life. The sight was already enough to chill the blood. Yet Stephen treated him not as a corpse, but as an enemy still capable of treachery. The accusations came swift and sharp. "You," Stephen thundered, pointing a trembling finger at the lifeless figure, "you who were Bishop of Porto dared to ascend unlawfully to the throne of Peter. You who swore oaths and broke them. You who, in your arrogance, dared to bless kings and ordain bishops, though you were unworthy." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some priests bowed their heads, others exchanged glances, half in fear, half in disbelief, but no one dared laugh, though the spectacle teetered on the edge of the absurd. The charges themselves were technical, drawn from canon law. Formosus had, years before, been appointed Bishop of Porto. According to strict interpretation, a bishop could not leave his see and take another. To Stephen, this was evidence of ambition, corruption, heresy. But beneath the legal mask lay the true reason: politics. Formosus had supported the Carolingians over the Spolitans, and in Rome, politics was war by other means. A deacon stood beside the corpse, Formosus's so-called advocate. With trembling hands, he rose to speak in defense of the dead pope. Yet how could he? What argument could pierce through a spectacle already decided? His words were drowned in Stephen's tirades, his voice cracking as he tried to answer accusations hurled at a lifeless skull. "Did you not conspire?" Stephen shrieked. "Did you not defile this holy office by your treachery? Speak!" The courtroom froze. All eyes turned to the corpse, as though expecting it to reply. The silence was unbearable. A silence so deep it seemed the walls themselves recoiled. Then, in a final stroke of mockery, Stephen ordered the advocate to answer for the corpse. "Speak for him. Let him confess his crimes." The deacon stammered, his voice barely a whisper, attempting to defend his long-dead master, but Stephen cut him off with rage. His words dripped with venom, spittle flying, robes shaking as he screamed into the face of death. It was less a trial than an exorcism, an attempt to purge not only Formosus's memory but the legitimacy he had granted. From the benches, the citizens of Rome watched with horror. Some clutched rosaries, whispering prayers under their breath. Others covered their faces, ashamed at what their church had become. A few, drawn by morbid curiosity, leaned forward with wide eyes, as if watching theatre staged by madness itself. The accusations multiplied: perjury, ambition, sacrilege, each one piled upon a body that could not respond, a grotesque avalanche of guilt heaped upon bones. And yet, beneath the fury, there was fear. Stephen's eyes darted from the corpse to the crowd, as if daring anyone to deny him, as if the very silence of Formosus was a threat. And so the absurdity deepened. A pope accused a corpse of crimes against God. A corpse sat enthroned, mocked by the living. And all of Rome held its breath, as though this charade might summon judgment not only on Formosus, but on them all. The Cadaver Synod had begun in earnest, and its grotesque theatre was only just unfolding. Part 5. The stripping of a pope. The verdict was never in doubt. From the very moment the grotesque trial began, the outcome was sealed by rage and politics. Still, the ritual had to play out. Rome sat in a hushed trance as Pope Stephen VI rose from his throne, his voice carrying a dreadful authority. "Formosus," he declared to the corpse, "we find you guilty. Guilty of ambition, guilty of perjury, guilty of profaning this sacred seat." The words fell like hammer blows. Some in the crowd wept openly, others averted their eyes. Yet there were also murmurs of approval from Stephen's allies. their faces lit with grim satisfaction. Then came the moment that turned horror into sacrilege. At Stephen's command, attendants stepped forward, their task, to strip the dead pope of his holy vestments. Piece by piece, the garments of office were torn away, the pallium, the stole, the chasuble, until the corpse sat slumped, a mockery of papal dignity. What had once symbolized Christ's authority on earth now lay scattered on the floor like rags. The people gasped. Even the most hardened soldiers shifted uneasily. To desecrate the body of a priest was already grave. To desecrate the body of a pope was unthinkable. And yet, the humiliation did not stop there. Stephen's eyes burned with manic fury as he gave the next order. "Remove the fingers." The attendants hesitated, horrified, but the Pope's command was absolute. Slowly, trembling, one of them stepped forward with a knife. He took the corpse's right hand, withered and stiff in death, and began to sever the 3 fingers that had once traced the sign of the cross in blessing. The sound of snapping bone echoed faintly in the chamber. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some cried out in horror. Others crossed themselves, as though fearing divine wrath might strike them down merely for witnessing the deed. A few even fled the basilica, unable to endure the blasphemy unfolding before their eyes. And there, on the tribunal floor, lay the fingers of Formosus, fingers that had blessed kings, absolved sins, consecrated bishops, now hacked from his body, discarded as if they were tokens of shame. Stephen was relentless. He commanded that the body, now defrocked, be dragged from the papal throne and cast down like refuse. Guards seized the corpse and pulled it across the floor, its head lolling grotesquely, its robes in tatters. No longer pope, no longer priest. Stephen declared that Formosus was stripped of all orders, reduced to nothing, unworthy even of burial. The air inside the basilica grew heavy, suffocating with dread. Witnesses later swore they felt the presence of something unnatural, as if the walls themselves recoiled at the desecration. Some whispered that God would not be mocked, that Rome itself would pay for this outrage. Yet Stephen's madness was not finished. He ordered that the mutilated body be taken from the church and thrown into a pauper's grave. A pope cast aside as garbage, condemned not only in life but in death. The Cadaver Synod had reached its monstrous climax. Rome would never be the same. Part 6. Into the river. The sentence should have ended with humiliation and burial, but Stephen VI was not content with mere disgrace. He demanded annihilation. Weeks after the trial, his men returned to the grave of Pope Formosus. They dug through the earth until their spades struck rotting flesh. With cruel efficiency, they hauled the corpse up once more, its body already bloated and foul with decay. To touch it was loathsome, but Stephen's command was law. The corpse was dragged through the streets of Rome, jeered at by soldiers but watched in silence by the people. The city was split. Some trembled before the madness of their pope, others clenched their fists in secret rage. Finally, the procession reached the banks of the Tiber. The river swirled dark and cold under a grey sky, its waters carrying Rome's refuse out to sea. There, without ceremony, the body of a pope was cast into the current. The splash echoed like a curse. For Stephen, it was a final erasure. By consigning Formosus to the river, he denied him even the dignity of rest in consecrated ground. No tomb, no relic, no shrine could rise to honor him. His name, Stephen vowed, would be drowned with his body. But Rome had seen enough. The whispers began almost immediately. They said the river itself rebelled, carrying Formosus back toward the city. Fishermen swore they saw the corpse snagged in the reeds, its face pale and swollen yet strangely serene. Word spread that miracles occurred where the body touched the water lamps that burned without oil. The sick suddenly restored. Whether truth or rumor, the effect was electric. To the people, it seemed as though God himself had rejected Stephen's cruelty. The river had become a witness against the living pope, and the martyred Formosus, a silent accuser from beyond the grave. Tension boiled over, murmurs turned into curses, curses into shouts. The streets of Rome filled with unrest. Citizens muttered that Stephen was no true shepherd, but a tyrant in papal robes. His enemies grew bolder, fanning the flames of rebellion, and soon, Rome would burn with fury. Stephen had thought he had silenced his rival forever, but by casting Formosus into the river, he had only given birth to a legend. The corpse he tried to erase now returned in stories and visions, rising from the depths not as a disgraced pope, but as a martyr, wronged by power. The tide of anger was rising, and Stephen, blind in his madness, could not see that the waters of the Tiber would soon sweep him away as well. Part 7. The Revolt of Rome. The Tiber had swallowed Formosus, but it had not silenced him. Instead, it gave him a voice louder than any sermon, a cry of injustice that spread from market stalls to noble courts. Rome whispered of miracles, of a river that rejected the cruelty of Stephen VI, and with every whisper, the people's anger sharpened like a blade. The tension broke in the summer heat of 897. Crowds surged through the narrow streets, their chants echoing off the stone walls of Rome. Down with Stephen, justice for Formosus. At first, Stephen dismissed them. He had cowed Rome once, he believed he could do it again. Surrounded by soldiers and clerics loyal to his madness, he strutted in the Lateran palace, convinced of his untouchable authority. But this time, Rome itself turned against him. The mob stormed through the city gates, a tide of humanity armed with stones, clubs, and fury. They smashed through markets, surged into squares, and filled the air with shouts. Some cried out in defense of the dead pope, others spat curses at the corruption of the living one, and still others shouted words not of faith, but of raw hatred: murderer, madman, blasphemer. The palace shook with the roar outside. Stephen's guards faltered, their loyalty cracking under the weight of the mob's wrath. When the gates of the Lateran burst open, the soldiers melted away. Stephen, once defiant, was dragged from his throne. The man who had dared to place a corpse on trial now faced a court of flesh and blood, the furious people of Rome. He was hurled into prison, the stench of rot and damp stone now his only company. For days he languished, pacing the dark cell, screaming his innocence, then cursing Formosus, then clawing at the walls as though he could escape the judgment pressing in from every side. But Rome had no patience for his ravings. In August 897, Stephen VI was strangled in his cell. Some say the executioners were soldiers sent by the new regime. Others insist it was the people themselves who stormed the prison, wrapping a rope around his throat in grim justice. However it happened, the result was the same. The Pope who had condemned the dead was himself condemned by the living. The irony was inescapable. Stephen had thought to erase Formosus's legacy by dragging his corpse through the streets, by stripping him of titles, by casting him into the river. Yet it was Stephen who was erased. His papacy remembered not for power or reform, but for madness and murder. Rome, restless and blood-stained, now stood on the edge of chaos. The Cadaver Synod had torn the veil from the papacy, exposing it not as a holy office, but as a battlefield of ambition and vengeance. The people who once knelt in awe before their shepherds now whispered of corruption, of divine wrath, of justice overturned. And yet, in the midst of that turmoil, Formosus's ghost seemed to rise higher than ever, his silence speaking louder than Stephen's fury. Part 8. The Ghost of Formosus. The death of Stephen VI did not end the nightmare. Rome, shaken to its core, still reeled from the madness of the Cadaver Synod. For months, the people spoke of little else. In taverns, whispers grew into drunken shouts. In churches, priests stammered through sermons, while congregants muttered about the day a corpse had been made to stand trial. The papacy, once cloaked in mystery and sanctity, now seemed fragile, vulnerable, even ridiculous. And yet, amid this chaos, the figure of Formosus refused to fade. He haunted the streets of Rome, not in flesh, but in memory. His pale corpse, bound to a chair, his lifeless hand raised in forced oaths, had seared itself into the minds of all who had seen or heard of it. Even those who had despised him in life now pitied him in death. It was not long before voices rose demanding justice, not only vengeance against Stephen, but restoration for Formosus. Could the Church allow such desecration to stand? Could a man who had worn the papal crown be left dishonored, his bones scattered, his name cursed? The new Pope, Theodore II, answered with an act of quiet defiance. In December 897, barely weeks after Stephen's strangulation, Theodore convened a synod of his own. But this was no trial of bones. It was a trial of history, He annulled the Cadaver Synod, denounced Stephen's deeds, and declared all of Formosus's acts valid once more. The dead pope was innocent. The dead pope was restored. And so, with solemn ceremony, the mutilated remains of Formosus were gathered from the Tiber and placed once more in hallowed ground at St. Peter's Basilica. The people watched as if Rome itself was being cleansed. Some wept openly. Others crossed themselves in relief. For a moment, it seemed as if the madness had been undone. But the ghost of the Cadaver Synod was not so easily buried. Pope John IX, successor to Theodore, reaffirmed the restoration, holding councils in Ravenna and Rome to forbid any future trial of the dead. He ordered that the records of Stephen's grotesque court be destroyed, as if by burning the parchment one might erase the memory. Yet, memory clung like smoke. Still, the shadow of Formosus lingered. Years later, under Sergius III, a man who had once sat as a judge at the Cadaver Synod, the nightmare returned. Sergius reinstated the synod's rulings, again condemning Formosus, again blackening his name. It was as though the grave could not hold him, as though his enemies could not stop dragging him back into the light. The Church staggered under the weight of its own contradictions. In the eyes of the faithful, it was no longer the voice of God but a battlefield of men, where rival popes fought wars not with swords, but with corpses, parchments, and proclamations. For the peasants who watched from the shadows of basilicas, the sight was terrifying. If the Holy Father could not rest in peace, what hope was there for anyone? Formosus's ghost had become more powerful than Formosus himself. He was no longer simply a pope, nor simply a corpse. He was a symbol of corruption, of vengeance, of how ambition could twist the sacred into the grotesque. And as the years rolled on, Rome would never forget. Part 9. A stain on the Church. What lingers after madness? Sometimes it is not the act itself, but the echo, the whisper that refuses to fade. The Cadaver Synod was such a whisper. Long after the corpse of Formosus had been buried, long after the men who condemned and defended him had themselves turned to dust, the memory of that grotesque trial stalked Rome like a phantom. Pilgrims who journeyed to the Eternal City would hear the story told in hushed tones. Guides pointed to the Tiber and murmured of a pope's body cast into its waters, a body that, according to legend, washed ashore with miraculous persistence, refusing to be silenced. In smoky taverns, merchants spoke of the trial of the dead pope with wide eyes, as if recounting a ghost story rather than history. Even peasants in distant villages knew the tale, a warning that not even the holy were safe from the claws of vengeance. In the basilicas, the priests tried to bury the memory under liturgies and incense, yet even here, whispers coiled like smoke. What sort of church drags its own pope from the grave? What sort of shepherds tear apart their flock to settle scores? The Cadaver Synod had exposed a truth too terrible to ignore, that beneath the golden vestments and sacred chants, Rome was a battlefield of power, as bloody and ruthless as any secular court. Satirists and chroniclers made their mark. Some mocked Stephen VI as a mad tyrant, a puppet of ambition who had turned God's altar into a theatre of horror. Others spoke of Formosus as a martyr, not only to faith but to envy and factionalism. In illuminated manuscripts, marginal doodles sometimes showed corpses propped upon thrones, a macabre echo of that infamous day. For centuries to come, the Cadaver Synod was remembered as the darkest joke ever told, at the expense of the papacy. And it was not only the common folk who trembled. The theologians, the monks, even the princes of Christendom, could not forget. The Synod had cracked the image of papal infallibility, revealing that popes were men of vanity, of cruelty, of madness. If a pope could be condemned in death by another pope, where was the certainty of God's will? Was the Church guided by heaven, or merely by the ambitions of men draped in holy robes? The Cadaver Synod became a scar, passed down through the centuries. When reformers in later ages sought to denounce corruption in Rome, they pointed to that grisly tribunal as proof of rot at the core. Even centuries later, Protestant polemicists would evoke the trial as evidence of papal corruption, holding it up like a mirror to shame their enemies. And yet, despite all efforts to erase it, the story endured. It could not be buried with Formosus. It could not be strangled with Stephen VI. It lived because it shocked, and in shocking, it revealed. The Cadaver Synod was no longer just an event. It was a symbol, a warning that when faith is consumed by politics, when vengeance wears the robes of holiness, even the sacred can be desecrated. The stain was set, and no prayer, no proclamation, no fire could ever wash it away. Last part, echoes through the ages. What remains when the fires burn out, when the crowds disperse, when the throne is empty? In the end, only the story. And the story of the Cadaver Synod has outlived every pope, every king, every empire of its age. In January 897, when Pope Stephen VI ordered the corpse of Formosus dragged before a tribunal, he believed he was securing his faction, silencing his enemies, stamping his authority upon Rome. Instead, he carved his name into infamy. Within months, he was overthrown and strangled in his cell. The tides of politics shifted, as they always do. But the act, the desecration of a corpse in the name of justice, could never be undone. For the faithful of medieval Europe, the trial became a riddle. Was it madness? Was it politics? Or was it something darker, a glimpse of how power can twist even the holiest institutions into grotesque theatre? Generations of chroniclers wrestled with that question. Some saw divine punishment in Stephen's downfall. Others saw it as proof that Rome had lost its way. All agreed on one point. The Church had never suffered such humiliation. And yet, there is something enduring in the image of Formosus propped upon that throne. He said nothing. He could say nothing. But in his silence, he condemned them all. He became a symbol of the futility of vengeance, of the corruption of power, of the fragility of the sacred when placed in human hands. Centuries later, reformers would point to the Cadaver Synod as a stain upon papal history. Protestants, critics of Rome, skeptics all seized upon it as proof that faith, when chained to politics, can descend into nightmare. And even today, the Synod remains unforgettable, not merely as an event, but as a warning etched into the fabric of history. So, what do we learn from this grotesque spectacle? Perhaps that power, unchecked, can turn even sanctity into farce. Perhaps that vengeance outlives the vengeful. Or perhaps that truth, like the body of Formosus cast into the Tiber, will always rise to the surface, no matter how many times it is sunk. 9 centuries after the ashes of Jeanne d'Arc were cast into the Seine, her name rose again in sainthood. But Formosus, he remains a shadow, forever chained to the Cadaver Synod, his life eclipsed by the trial of his corpse. And yet the story endures because it forces us to ask, if the guardians of faith could fall to such madness, what might we too become when driven by fear, by envy, by ambition? This is not just the tale of a dead pope, it is the tale of humanity itself, stumbling between faith and folly, between the sacred and the profane. And so the Cadaver Synod closes, not with justice, not with redemption, but with a question that echoes across time. What do we see when we look at power draped in holiness, truth, or a mask hiding corruption? If you want to uncover more shocking, forgotten stories of medieval Europe, the scandals, betrayals, and mysteries that shaped our world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter of history's dark theatre.